So, IDOR is the vulnerability type most likely to be recommended to beginners in bug bounty. And the reason for that is that it's very simple to find and it doesn't require a lot of technical knowledge. So, all it takes is a decent amount of time and persistence. That being said, though, it's becoming harder and harder to find these vulnerabilities because modern frameworks actually solve a lot of the issues that cause this kind of vulnerability to arise. So, is it still worth looking for these vulnerabilities? Well, with the proper methodology, I think that it is. And in this video, I'll walk you through some of the things that I do to find IDORs, and hopefully, if you're a beginner, that will help you find your first bounty in the bug bounty world. So, insecure direct object reference. What does that mean? Well, what is an object, first of all? An object is usually some kind of programming class, like you can see here. Usually has a name, like you can see user, and then it contains certain values like name, email, and ID. So if you're familiar with something like Python, you can create a class and then you can declare values inside that class, and then it just gets stored in memory, right? So that's kind of what we mean by object. And it can really be anything. Like for example, if you had a project management app and then you could create different projects, each of those projects would be its own object. It would contain the tasks that are inside of it, which are themselves objects, and then it would have like a name and like team members assigned to it, for example. And objects are generally stored in the database. So behind the website is just sits like a database, and these objects will be stored in there. And in order to store something in memory or in a database, you need to give it some kind of key that you can find it later. And this is kind of known as a primary key. And in this scenario, it's going to be the ID. And usually it's some kind of unique identifier, so like a string of numbers that's not going to get repeated because you can't have more than one kind of primary key. So you might have a user with the same name and the same email, but the ID cannot be the same, right? And then if you want to access this later, you would ask the database for this user with this identifier, and the database would give it back to you. So that's how objects are stored behind the scenes in memory, and sorry, in the database, and then they can be accessed later by the website. So let's say we have this endpoint here, we found it, and this allows us to list a user. So we have this user endpoint, then we have something here called a query parameter, right? So this is just a bit of data that the server is going to read off, right? It's going to be able to access this. And we've just pointed it to this one identifier, right? So this is just the number one. And let's say that's our user. So we're supposed to be able to access them, and that just basically means that we can read off our own data. Right, that makes sense. But what if we were to change this like two? Well, if we did that and this server was vulnerable to IDOR, the server would go on and ask the database for the key with number two. And that's probably not our user. So in that case, it might return someone else's data to us that we're not supposed to see. That's what an IDOR is. It's it's basically when the server accepts user input without authenticating it, and then basically returns the object with that identifier. So that basically allows us to read off someone else's data that we're not supposed to see. And it's usually not this simple, it's usually not in like a query parameter, but it could come up in something like JSON data or some other part of the website where there's not authentication happening. And this happens most frequently in very large websites that have like huge APIs. They have hundreds of different objects which each have their own identifier, and they have to check it in every single endpoint. So it makes it difficult to basically prevent this kind of vulnerability, although some frameworks nowadays kind of try and implement authentication a lot better, and it's definitely gotten a lot easier to do it, but these vulnerabilities can still crop up, especially as new features get added. So that's what an IDOR is. Now I'll just show you a little demo example of how it might look like on a website. So this is a website which uses the same user object as I showed before in the examples. And here I've just asked the website for the user of ID 1. And you can see here it's returned to me my user, which is JacobJN, and it's returned example.com. Now, if this website was vulnerable to IDOR, I could go in here and type 2 and then see a different user, could for example leak their email. And that could be a vulnerability that you could report. And how could I escalate this vulnerability? Because obviously going over every single number is going to be difficult. Well, I made a video on fuzzing previously, which is useful for enumerating these identifiers. So if I go over here into Kaido, for example, I can show you how to basically from an IDOR vulnerability with a sequential ID, how to extract all the users. So go here, can find our request here, then can send it to something called automate. And I showed a lot of this in my video on fuzzing, so if you haven't seen that already, go watch that. But what we can basically do is just stick an injection point here, turn a list of numbers, and then just have it run here. And this is going to get back all our users. So we can go here, see we have the users in here. So that could allow us to enumerate a lot of email addresses, which we can use for like phishing or something like that. So websites actually do care about stuff like this, and it just does leak. It leaks something called personal identifiable information, which is something that websites also really care about. So that's one example of an IDOR there, and this uses sequential identifiers. And sequential identifiers kind of going away now because there's something called unique identifiers, which are a lot better, or UUIDs. So these are, let me show you. So these are, I think, 32-digit identifiers, which are generated by a completely random equation. They're not 100% random, nothing really is, but if they're using the latest version of UUIDs, so UUID 4, then it's going to be very hard to guess it. And if you just compute the math on this, there's 10 possible digits for every 32 spaces in a UUID. That means there's 32 to the power of 10 possible combinations of unique identifiers here. So your chance of guessing it every time is 1 to the power of, sorry, is 1 over 32 to the power of 10, which is a tiny number. So realistically, guessing these identifiers isn't going to happen. And most websites use something like this to represent their objects now instead of using sequential identifiers like these over here. So what do you do if you see a unique identifier instead of a sequential identifier? So let's say you find an IDOR, great, it's one of these things, you've tested it against your own account. But then how do you figure out the unique identifier for other users, since you can't just go up the numbers like I just did with the previous example? Well, I think the best way to do this is to find a way to leak these identifiers. So I've created something here which is list is equal to true, and this will just show us all of the user keys. And when we have the key, what we can just do is we can come in here and then just type it up here and say, look at the key like that. So the goal is to try and find this unique identifier somewhere on the website. And this is actually quite common. So you can imagine like a marketplace app, right? If you have a marketplace app, then there's going to be different posts and they're going to all be displayed publicly to everyone, right? And what would be quite common is for the object that is the post, right? So I'll say here, right? So in the backend, it will be like a post object, like this. What's actually usually quite common is the post object would have a user object tied into it, right? And this user object would contain the ID of the user who made the post. So if you can find something like this that leaks the user identifier, then you could use this ID for your IDOR. And that's one way to get around this unique identifier issue. And if you can't find anything like this, if you can't find something that leaks the unique identifier, you can report it anyway, although you might get a lower bounty for it. I think websites should still fix IDORs even though the unique identifier isn't really leakable. And this isn't something that's very secure anyway. If an attacker wanted to, they could probably convince like a victim to send them this or something like that. So I think a website should fix this anyway. And if they don't give you a bounty for it, I think that's not very good on their end. So that's essentially the example of an IDOR with sequential identifiers and then with unique identifiers. So that's one way you can find it. And now I'll just show you a methodology to find IDORs using JavaScript and then GraphQL and WebSockets. So three things that a lot of people miss and where I think a lot of IDORs can still be found. So for this example, I'm just going to use the Asana application because they just happen to use some of the stuff that I think is worth testing on. And just as an example, I'm going to go over here. I'm just going to add a task with a random name, say test like that. And then I'm going to go into Kaido. So a lot of people just hunt for IDORs and APIs, kind of JSON type applications, and kind of just finish at that. But I think there's a lot more IDORs to be found in places that people don't look at because they're often a bit annoying to look at, like WebSockets. Now, the WebSocket protocol is absolutely infuriating to work with, but that also means that a lot of people don't look at them very often. So if you go to the latest request that I've sent here, I think is up here somewhere. So let's look at this WebSocket request right here, right? So this is a WebSocket mutation, which I use to create the task. And as you can see here, it's just finishing the setup. So you can see right here, this large number right here. And this is actually a sequential identifier for this task object. And if we wanted to test for an IDOR, the best way here would just to just change this with a different task that we know exists. So if I was to replay this WebSocket request, what I would do to try and look for an IDOR is change this to something else and then check if I can modify someone else's task. And then what I would then do is if I confirm that happened, is try and find a way to leak the task names. So maybe try and look at like a public project or something like that and see if I can modify tasks on that. Or like try and source the task name some other way. And let's have a look if there's anything else. Yeah, so maybe something like this as well. This is going to allow us to delete a task. And if I was to just replace this identifier with something else and test if I can do it against another user, then I could possibly find an IDOR that way. And I've had a lot more luck with this in WebSockets than I have with traditional REST APIs or other more tested on platforms because WebSockets they don't have as much frameworks for authorization as the other API frameworks do. So I think it's actually very good to test on stuff like WebSockets because it's just most people haven't tested on it as often, and two, there's actually not as many frameworks available for companies to secure these. So keep in mind that, and then yeah, basically you just test. It's gonna take a lot of time to find IDORs. Is just very time consuming, but it's probably worth it, especially if you're testing on things that are high ROI like WebSockets. Now another thing that I wanted to show you is just a way to basically do a bit of recon with IDORs. And the best way to find IDORs is to test on something that no one has tested on. And the best way to find something that nobody has tested on is to do a bit of recon. And I'm going to show you this extension called Link Finder. And this was made by your Rhino Raider, I think. And what it basically will just do is it will show us all the endpoints that it can find in the JavaScript. So these kind of things here, right? And basically, what I would do here is, for example, let's say we had this task create endpoint, the one that we just used. So let me just open a new address here, this, so that we can see the page again. I would, oops, that's not what I wanted to do. Go back. I would go back to the task create page. I would copy this task create endpoint here, like so. Open up the God's sakes. Right, open up the debugger here, and then I would actually try and find this endpoint in the JavaScript and see what the request looks like. Now, I could also just go and test it myself, but if it's something that you haven't seen in the application before, so if you've been testing a lot and you haven't seen this endpoint, it might be worth trying to find this in the debugger. If it actually works. Yeah, great. So if you go here and we go to search, like that, we'll hopefully, I'll give this a little bit of time, but hopefully it will find the endpoint here, like so. And then we'll be able to look at the JavaScript and see and actually test for this endpoint as well. And it's come back with a lot of endpoints, as you can see. I'm sure some of these aren't actually like being used. There's potentially being like deprecated endpoints and stuff like that. So by looking through this, you can actually find a lot more material to test on, and then you can find stuff that other people haven't been testing on because it's not like documented or anything like that. So that's a great way to do a bit of recon on IDORs and basically get more. Why does that keep happening? Basically, get more like potential for success for your time. So basically, increase your ROI. And the last thing that I wanted to show you, the last kind of good place to test for IDORs, and I don't think this is going to work on Asana, so we'll just go to HackerOne instead. We'll go here, and the other place is called GraphQL. And this is a query language kind of similar to SQL that allows websites to, oops, I guess that's not going to work there. That allows basically websites to access with databases, but it's often exposed to users, which is unusual because SQL is usually never exposed to a user, but GraphQL is. And it's kind of a specific language that's used to basically fetch stuff in the database, and it also happens to use identifiers. So if you see something here, right? So this is what a query looks like in GraphQL, and it's like organization providers query, right? So you can see this ID parameter here as well. And when you send the query in, then there's going to be an ID that appears there. So a great way to test for IDORs is to just replace the ID with another ID. So an ID of an organization, for example, see if you can fetch details about that organization that you're not supposed to see. So that's a great way to test for IDORs without kind of just testing the stuff that everyone else has tested for. And I would just do the same thing here. So I would literally just come here and I would open this stuff again here. And then I would try and find this in the JavaScript and see if I can get any details about how to send this request. And again, you could probably find this on the website actually, but again, if there's something deprecated or if it's not being used anymore, it could be a great place to test for IDORs, and it could be a good payout for a vulnerability here. You see, it's just listed here, name kind, for example, and we could probably construct this request inside something like Kaido or Burp Suite, send it in, and then basically test for an IDOR. And as far as I know, most GraphQL requests are sent to this endpoint / GraphQL. Might be something different for HackerOne, but it's usually sent to the same directory, usually with the post request nowadays. So basically, you can test on it by doing that. You could also intercept another GraphQL request which is being sent from your browser, and then modify it with the stuff that you want to send instead. So that's, I think, 3 great ways to test for IDOR vulnerabilities is to check for WebSockets. Most applications now use WebSockets for real-time communication. So try and find the identifier in WebSockets and then replace it with another user's identifier. Second one is to use JavaScript. So try and look for endpoints that other users aren't using and then try and look for IDORs in there, like sending identifiers, like a task create endpoint. You can change the ID there, delete someone else's task. And the third bit is to look at GraphQL. GraphQL is a query language as well, and it uses identifiers. So naturally, we just switch the identifier with someone else's and see if we can access, modify, or delete their data. So that's kind of all I wanted to show you with IDORs, and I hope that it gave you a better understanding of how to look for them. Just go back to the main screen here. Yeah, so I hope this video gave you a better understanding of how to look for IDORs. I covered what IDORs are, and I also covered my methodology for looking for them. It's probably been my most lucrative vulnerability type, although I'm starting to go into a bit more advanced vulnerabilities as I kind of level up in my bug bounty game. But if you haven't found a vulnerability, then this is actually a great one to look for. And I also just want to mention that I have Bug Bounty Labs. You can find the link in the description. It's 12 hands-on labs that cover server-side vulnerabilities. So IDOR is a server-side vulnerability, and it will basically give you the practical side of bug bounty. Here in these videos, I'm kind of just going over the theory, but to learn you have to do it yourself. So you'll build up kind of the muscle memory, and when it comes time to find it in a real website, you'll remember the practicals, and then you'll go off and get the bounty yourself. So do check it out in the link in the description. But apart from that, I wanted to thank you for watching, and I want to say happy hunting.